So good morning and welcome to the December 17th meeting of the Standing Committee on Environment Protection, Water and Waste Management. My name is Scott. Welcome. We only have councillors. Jean is the only councillor on the left side today. All of our other councillors are on the right side. So we have full right side councillors today. Our left side councillors could not make it today. So our typical right side councillors are all right here. Very typical right leaning councillors. And I'm just sitting here in the middle. Declaration of interest, and we have a couple visitors, Councillor Harder and Councillor Sudds from the far south and west reaches of the city. Declaration of interest. Seeing none. Any interest in anything? A little bit? Confirmation minutes from our meeting of Tuesday, November 19th, 2019. Anyone read them? Carried? Thank you. So we have two items on the agenda today, the Climate Change Master Plan and the Energy Evolution Model, as well as the Tree Bylaw Review Project. I had to skip like 6 pages to get to it. So, and that's it. So we're going to hold both items, obviously, because we have presentation and delegations on both. So we will go immediately into the Climate Change Master Plan and Energy Evolution Model. So we have Andrea Flowers and Jen Brown and Mike Fletcher and Don Herdwire. I believe you have a 643-page presentation. Am I off a bit? I'm off by like a few hundred pages.
Good morning, Chair, members of committee. My name is Don Herdwire. I'm the Director of Economic Development and Long Range Planning. This morning I'm joined by Jen Brown, Andrea Flowers, Mike Fletcher, all from our Climate Change and Resiliency Unit. Jen will handle the first part of the presentation, and Andrea will pick up from there. Before I turn it over to Jen, I'd like to thank staff from across the corporation, all of our external stakeholders, and our Climate Change Council Sponsors Group, which includes Chair Moffat, Councillors Menard, Councillor Fleury, Councillor Sudds, Councillor Kavanaugh, and Councillor Dudas. And just like to thank them for their input and guidance that they provided to get us where we are today. So this report builds on the official plan preliminary policy directions that were approved by Council last week, and it provides a framework for Ottawa to transition into a clean, renewable, and resilient city by 2050. So I'd like to turn it over to Jen.
Thanks, Don. This morning's presentation was built as a walkthrough of the report recommendations. I will start with an overview of the first set of recommendations, which asks that committee receive the 2017 and 2018 greenhouse gas emissions inventories, approve the new short, mid, and long-term targets to reduce corporate emissions by 100% by 2040 and community emissions by 100% by 2050, as well as approve the proposed climate change master plan, which includes 8 priority actions. Andrea will then present the second half of the report recommendations, which asks that committee receive an update on energy evolution, which includes the draft energy and emissions model, as well as the draft list of 20 proposed projects. Direct staff to bring forward the final energy evolution report in Q2 of 2020, which will include the final energy and emissions model, the detailed project descriptions, as well as the financial analysis. Delegate authority to the Climate Change Council Sponsors Group to provide the Mayor with a list of priority areas and activities to advocate to senior levels of government on opportunities to implement the Climate Change Master Plan and supporting documents. And finally, approve the spending plan for the unspent Hydro Ottawa dividend surplus. I'm just going to switch here. Worldwide, climate scientists agree that the fast-rising global temperatures have created a climate emergency. In 2018, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or more commonly referred to as the IPCC, released a special report that provided the scientific evidence for the need to limit global warming increases to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Scientists estimate that we could reach the 1.5 target within the next 10 years, but that achieving the 1.5 target is possible with rapid, far-reaching, and unprecedented changes in all aspects of society. On the national level, the federal government released this year Canada's Changing Climate Report, which confirmed that Canada is warming twice as fast as the rest of the world. In response to the latest climate science, more than 900 cities and jurisdictions around the world have declared a climate emergency. Within Canada, over 450 cities and regional governments have declared a climate emergency, along with the Canadian House of Commons and the Assembly of First Nations. On April 24th, Ottawa City Council joined the global movement and declared a climate emergency for the nation's capital. The timing of the review and update of the Air Quality and Climate Change Management Plan was then well positioned as the science, legislative context, and opportunities had evolved significantly since the plan was approved in 2014. As such, staff proposed that the Air Quality and Climate Change Management Plan be renamed and repositioned as the Climate Change Master Plan, and to elevate it to a policy level that aligns with other existing master plans. The proposed Climate Change Master Plan has a vision to take unprecedented collective action to transition Ottawa into a clean, renewable, and resilient city by 2050. This is guided by the principles that everybody has a responsibility to manage energy consumption and to mitigate risks, that collaboration is needed amongst everyone to effect change and develop joint solutions, that municipal leadership is required to ensure an integrated and comprehensive approach among the corporation and the community, that coordination is required among all long-term municipal plans, the comprehensive asset management program, and the long-term financial plans to ensure a harmonized strategic approach. And finally, to ensure that an equity and inclusion considerations are incorporated into all decision-making processes. The proposed Climate Change Master Plan would be the overarching framework as it looks at how Ottawa both mitigate and adapt to climate change over the coming decade. Mitigation refers to the need to reduce our energy consumption and our greenhouse gas emissions. Adaptation refers to the need to adapt to the impacts of climate change today and build resiliency for the future. If we break it down by the two supporting streams, most of the work to date has been done on the mitigation side, in that the city has completed greenhouse gas emissions inventories, set corporate and community greenhouse gas emission reduction targets, and is developing energy evolution, which is the strategic action plan for how we will achieve said targets. On the adaptation side, work has begun on the climate projections, which would feed into the vulnerability assessment and climate resiliency strategy, the latter being the supporting document which would support building resiliency in Ottawa to the impacts of climate change. In recent years, Ottawa has made progress in investing in and implementing mitigation and adaptation measures. Key mitigation initiatives include building out the light rail transit network and investing in electric buses, landfill gas improvements at Trail Road Waste Facility, incorporating further energy efficiency measures at city facilities, and developing the Complete Streets implementation framework. Key adaptation measures include the public health and emergency preparedness, flood risk management, which includes updating the floodplain mapping, the combined sewage storage tunnel, which is a signature project under the Ottawa River Action Plan, and the urban forest management plan. At the city, we undertake two types of greenhouse gas emission inventories, community and corporate. Starting with community inventories track emissions associated with those activities that happen within the geographic boundaries of Ottawa and are broken down into 4 sectors: buildings, transportation, waste, and agriculture. In 2018, roughly 90% of our emissions came from the buildings and transportation sector, which is a consistent pattern that we've seen since 2012. If you look at the largest contributing energy source, that would be natural gas, followed by gasoline and diesel. Corporate emissions track emissions related to our municipal operations. It is also broken down into 4 sectors: facilities, fleet, which can be broken down into transit fleet, municipal fleet, and police fleet, Trail Road Waste Facility, and ROPEC. The largest contributing sector within the corporate inventory was fleet. with transit fleet accounting for 52% of emissions and the municipal fleet accounting for 13% of emissions. Diesel is the largest contributing source within the corporate inventory, accounting for 60% of corporate emissions. In 2018, the corporate emissions accounted for roughly 5% of total community emissions, but it's estimated by the Federation of Canadian Municipalities that the municipality has influence over roughly half of emissions within a community. We currently have 3 council-approved greenhouse gas emission reduction targets. We have a short-term community target to reduce emissions by 12% by 2024 and a long-term target to reduce community emissions by 80% by 2050. On the corporate side, we have a short-term target to reduce emissions by 2024 by 20% by 2024. Since 2012, community emissions have decreased by 14%. This is largely attributable to the former provincial government's decision to phase out coal plants and the significant reductions associated with generating electricity in Ontario. On the corporate side, emissions have decreased by 36% since 2012. This is largely attributed to the decline in emissions due to the increased landfill gas capture efficiencies at Trail Road Waste Facility, as well as also benefiting from the provincial phase-out of coal plants and efficiencies made within the city facilities. As previously mentioned, the city does not have direct control beyond its own operations. As such, in order to mobilize community action, council can continue to set ambitious targets, monitor greenhouse gas emissions regularly, and can communicate these results to residents. And this would be consistent with the action that we've seen in municipalities across the country and would align with the call to action from the IPCC and Ottawa's own climate emergency declaration. As such, staff recommends setting new short and mid-term targets, as well as setting a new long-term commitment to reduce community emissions by 100% by 2050, which would align with the IPCC target to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. While corporate emissions from municipal operations are a small percentage of total community emissions, leading by example is critical for setting the pace, spurring innovation, and catalyzing community action. As such, the municipality could strive to set a corporate target to reduce corporate emissions by 100% by 2040. Under this scenario, the city is on track to achieving its 2025 short-term target. However, it should be noted that starting in 2021, it is expected that we will see an increase in emissions at the Trail Road Waste Facility as a result of provincial regulatory requirements. The proposed climate change master plan has identified 8 priority actions for the next 5 years that can be embedded into city business that can work towards achieving our greenhouse gas emission reduction targets and build resiliency in Ottawa. The first 3 priorities are well underway. Andrea will walk us through energy evolution momentarily. On the resilience side, staff are working with the National Capital Commission and the Environment and Climate Change Canada on developing climate projections for the National Capital Region, and it's expected that this information will be released in Q2 of 2020, which will then lead into a vulnerability assessment, which will be initiated also in 2020. And lastly, the preliminary policy directions for the official plan were approved by Council last week that incorporated energy and climate resiliency considerations. Additionally, the groundwork has been laid to apply a climate lens to asset management and capital projects, and it is being driven by provincial regulatory requirements. The last 4 priorities have been identified as critical for the short term, as they will, as critical areas to be explored and developed in the short term in order to advance the long-term vision. These critical areas include piloting corporate carbon budgets within the Planning, Infrastructure and Economic Development Department and Ottawa Public Health, exploring carbon sequestration methods, encouraging private action through multiple avenues, and developing a governance framework. In order to keep us on track, staff proposed annual reporting to committee that would include annual community and corporate emission inventories, progress towards achieving our greenhouse gas emission reduction targets, an update on the climate change master plan priorities and recommendations to advance these priorities, and budget and staffing pressures as required. I will now turn over the presentation to Andrea.
Thanks, Jen. I'm going to walk you through an update on the project called Energy Evolution. Energy Evolution is Ottawa's community energy transition strategy. The vision of that project is for Ottawa to be a thriving city powered by clean, renewable energy. And we propose to do this through three key areas. First, collectively, we need to reduce energy consumption through efficiency and conservation. Then we need to increase our supply of renewable energy through local and regional renewable energy development. And third, we need to prioritize the procurement of clean, renewable energy. Energy Evolution has been completed over the course of 2 phases. In phase 1, which started in 2016, a sounding board of community technical experts and interested stakeholders was established. A series of technical working groups were also established in phase 1. Through these technical working groups, 7 pathways were developed that charted a path on how we would increase our renewable energy generation as part of getting towards Council's current target of 80% reductions by 2050. In December of 2017, Committee and Council approved phase 1 of Energy Evolution, which included 33 projects as part of an action plan, 8 projects funded through the Hydro Ottawa dividend surplus, and 8 community energy innovation projects funded through an innovation fund. In phase 2, an additional 7 pathways were developed to look at energy conservation and efficiency in buildings, transportation, waste, and electricity. All pathways that were completed in phase 1 and 2 were combined into an integrated energy and emissions model. This model charts out the path on how we can achieve either Council's current target of 80% reductions by 2050 or the target of 100% reductions to align with the IPCC call to limit global warming increase to 1.5 degrees. As part of phase 2, a list of proposed projects was also developed for Energy Evolution. Throughout Energy Evolution, staff have worked with councillors, sounding board members, and technical working groups that include both staff and community technical experts. A Climate Change Council sponsors group was established through the climate emergency declared in April of this year, and staff have worked with an interdepartmental working group. Over the last 3 years, there's been more than 30 meetings with more than 180 key stakeholders in Ottawa, representing approximately 90 organizations. Through the pathways, we first established a business as planned. So in the top line of the graph before you, you can see the green line maps out the business as planned. Basically, this looks at projects that Council has already approved and figured out what our emissions would be with the work which is already slated to happen. The business as planned scenario includes a range of projects, including some of our showcase projects like LRT Stage 1 and Stage 2. What you'll see from the graph above is that the line stays almost flat despite the fact that our population increases to about 1.5 million up until 2050. What you can also see from the graph on the screen is that there's a significant gap between our current reductions of 80% and the proposed 100% reduction. Energy Evolution takes a look at where those proposed emissions will come from in 5 key areas: electricity, transportation, waste and renewable natural gas, existing buildings, and new buildings. This slide shows what it would take for us to make reductions in the 80% scenario. You can see from the dark red or almost purple band that transportation represents the single largest sector in which emissions would come from, emission reductions would come from. When I flip to the next slide, you'll see that there's a change particularly for electricity. The difference between the 80% and the 100% scenario, that 20% difference, almost half of it comes from reducing the carbon left in the electricity grid and from accelerating the adoption of heat pumps. So if we switch to the next slide, you can see that the proportion of electricity required to meet our 100% increases. Existing buildings also increases, and that's where we see the accelerated adoption of heat pumps. As part of the status update for Energy Evolution, there is a list of 20 proposed projects for staff to work with community and staff stakeholders and develop over the next several months. In each of the proposed areas, we've given examples of projects which we will move forward. Under buildings, we propose to develop a residential and commercial accelerator program for retrofits, as well as a high-performance development standard. In the transportation sector, we propose a personal and commercial electric vehicle strategy, 100% zero-emission transit fleets, as well as transportation mode shift framework, which would be incorporated into the Transportation Master Plan. Under waste and renewable natural gas, we propose to divert organics from landfill and increase renewable natural gas development. In electricity, we'll develop an electricity resource strategy, and because private action is a critical area both in the Climate Change Master Plan and in Energy Evolution, we propose to develop a climate change education and outreach program, as well as something called Fund the Evolution, which would look at a range of financial mechanisms currently available to the municipality to fund the change required, as well as look to alternative sources of funding to fund the changes and projects required. We propose to bring forward a final report in Q2 of 2020, which will include the final energy and emissions model. We also have started doing a detailed financial and affordability analysis of each of the 44 actions included in the draft energy and emissions model. That financial and affordability analysis will include an overview of the capital and operating costs, as well as potential savings and revenue generation. As part of the final report, we intend to bring forward more detailed descriptions of the proposed projects, including timelines, resources, and milestones. Finally, we'll bring forward a proposed spending plan for the 2019 Hydro Ottawa dividend surplus once the amount is known, and committee would have to approve that once the formal amount is known. In terms of next steps for both the Climate Change Master Plan and Energy Evolution, throughout Q1 of 2020, we will continue to work with the Climate Change Sponsors Group, as well as staff and community partners on the priority areas outlined in the Climate Change Master Plan, as well as the 20 proposed projects in Energy Evolution. We will also be hiring a communication and outreach staff member who will develop a communication and engagement strategy. In Q2 2020, we propose to bring forward the final report on Energy Evolution as outlined in the previous slide. And as part of the adaptation response, in Q2 2020, we will be bringing forward the local climate projections, which we have developed in partnership with Environment Canada Climate Change and the National Capital Commission. By the end of 2020, we will bring forward the first annual update on the Climate Change Master Plan, including an update on the proposed 8 priorities and the projects within. That concludes our presentation, so I turn it back to you, Chair, for any questions.
Thank you very much. What we want to do first, of course, is go to delegations. So if we can free up, either John, if you could just shift to the other side. List. Our first speaker is Joan Haysom. And Joan will be followed by Sharon Coward of the Enviro Center. Thank you, and thank you for your participation in the past several years on various aspects of what led us to this report here today.
It's been a pleasure to continue to be involved and continue to provide insights where possible. One of the things I want to really point out from the report and the analysis done is that 95% of the city's emissions come from non-corporate sources. This has actually been understood since 2012. 7 years and 3 rounds of study later, we still don't have any policies or major policies or programs that influence, nudge, or encourage people to change their behaviors. I'm concerned that the next stage includes further rounds of strategy work with very little action and very little budget to support it. We need action. I will choose today to focus on buildings, which is likely one of the toughest challenges and most impactful, as we saw from the earlier graph of how to get to 80% reductions. I'm leading an innovative energy group at J.L. Richards, long-established firm here in Ottawa. My team brings low energy and low carbon solutions to buildings, wastewater, treatment, mining, and industrial sectors. We are currently designing a new corporate office that includes many low or zero carbon energy and carbon targets within it. We understand the investment returns of these design elements. However, currently, there's a gap of knowledge and/or motivation in many clients for changing business as usual and how they develop the city and how they build their buildings. I encourage the city to show leadership and strength and a spine to create an environment where we build a better city. Building codes and building permits are a major policy driver that guide this sector. As I said, buildings are one of the major components of GHG emissions, and municipalities do play a significant influence in what is built. They have the jurisdiction to adapt building permits and development processes to impact the required climate change mitigation needs of the city. There are several policies, such as mandatory energy and GHG analysis done by the proponents submitting a building permit, preferential development processes for low energy or low carbon buildings, such as faster turnaround times. Those are both low cost things that can quickly influence a major component of the sector. I note that the report suggests the adoption of a high performance building standard, and I'm strongly in favor of that being taken into action as soon as possible. Additionally, the city needs to lead, right from the very top, the public conversation and providing a strong voice that advocates for the advantages of building a low-carbon city. Why should the city show leadership on this? Because of the clean energy economy. The clean energy economy creates jobs, and these jobs are predominantly local. Think of all the retrofit work that could be undertaken using local Ottawa citizens. More specifically, for some numbers, a study from Eco Canada shows, these are national numbers, that 436,000 workers are directly employed in energy efficiency. And by implementing the Pan-Canadian framework, Canada can create an additional 118,000 annual jobs. This sector employs more than the oil, gas, and telecommunications sectors combined. Ottawa needs to make sure that it's part of the growth of this economy. If we stand and wait, we lose. Companies, consultants, constructors will gain advantages in the cities where they are located, and then they'll be able to work outwards. We need opportunity here within Ottawa right now. Some of the cities that are further ahead of Ottawa include Edmonton, Peel, Halton Hills, Hamilton, Mississauga, Toronto, Vancouver, and the list goes on. And there's enormous cost to not doing this, from people's monthly energy bills to lack of economic growth, let alone the impacts of climate change will impose upon us. The costs of acting are lower than the costs of not and having to react. I'd like to, therefore, greatly encourage the high-performance building standards and other actions with regards to building and development permits. Make the things that are in the official plan, where we're talking about a climate lens, make sure that that does not stick at the high level, but is able to move down into actual actionable items by the people that are doing the day-to-day work. I see many cases where that is not yet happening in several organizations here in Ottawa. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Ace. Appreciate it. Questions for... So we have a lot of speakers today. I don't think there's going to be any need for the clapping or the jeering that we might get in other committees. Let's just assume we're all on the same page and that we all appreciate everything everyone's saying. Go ahead.
Thanks very much, Chair. Thanks for your presentation. Just have one question, because I agree with you. We need to be taking action on that, but and you seem to have this information.
Yep.
What concrete suggestions can you give to staff or councillors on the city incenting private buildings to make this transition? Because we have our own control over the organization's buildings, but the incenting of private buildings to do this, obviously there's a savings associated, but I'd like to see if you can write to us, follow up. Obviously you can't talk about it all now, but the concrete suggestions on the ground that we could do to incent that type of behavior.
As the very briefest of answers, I think it's through the building permit process and the development rule sets that are there. You can create incentives for lower energy solutions to be built first.
Agreed, and that's on our new builds.
That's on your list,
But a large portion of our emissions now are on
retrofits,
current buildings that are already built. So we need the information on the incenting of the current buildings that are already there to really get to these targets. So if you have more on that, even whether written to us or
I'll write back in later and bring some other experts to the table too.
okay, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Menard. Any other questions? Seeing none. Thank you very much. So we now have Sharon Coward with Enviro Center, followed by Rob Barnes.
Hi, good morning. Thank you for having me here. As mentioned, I'm from Enviro Center. We are a nonprofit environmental organization located here in town. Our work encourages local residents, businesses, and communities to take action on climate in practical and tangible ways. We are a long-term partner of the City of Ottawa. For us, the city's role in climate action, its minimum role, is to take the lead, adopt and support a path, and leverage its public role in the community to catalyze effective collective climate action. I wanted to come this morning to speak in support of the city taking on this draft climate change master plan. The work laid out in this plan is enormous, but is in keeping with the enormous scale of work to be done if we're going to keep our world healthy and stable, if we're going to keep our city resilient and strong in the face of the changes that we already know are coming. Work at this scale needs to be a coordinated effort, and there are actors all over the city ready to take action and move our city and country in the right direction. This is a big plan for sure, but the city doesn't have to do all the work. This plan will only be accomplished with partners. The city's role is to take action where it has the power to do so, and maybe most importantly, to lead. Partners will rise to the occasion and meet you. This draft plan is already an example of what the city can do to push the needle on climate action, bring partners together, and begin to build a resilient city. There's still a lot of work to be done, obviously, and plans to be fleshed out, but we have the beginning here of a concrete plan of action specific to our city, and that is incredibly important. The new targets outlined in this plan are necessary and good. They match what is actually required here in Ottawa and everywhere else in the world to match the Paris Agreement, but more importantly in the real world, to avoid the worst effects of climate change. And what is not always obvious when we talk about mitigation plans is that the measures taken to meet these mitigation targets involve investments that improve the resilience, the health, the equity, and the livability of our city. From our low-income buildings and homes, to our streets and sidewalks, to our local energy generation and construction economies. The beauty of planned climate action is that it is deeply practical. It responds to the fundamental requirements of our world: weather, ecosystems, materials, food, and supports a system that works, not just in the enormous macro scale, but right here in Ottawa, right in your own house. Meeting these targets here in Ottawa and following this path outlined will be hard. It will not be impossible, but definitely hard work. And yes, there is a chance that we will fail to meet these targets. But failure to strive for these targets would be failure of much larger proportions. Failure to strive for these targets would be Ottawa failing to meet the most basic obligation to our residents, to our neighbors, to our society. Failure to set and try for these targets would be Ottawa failing to try to keep our world livable. That should be the failure that we are most afraid of. We here in Ottawa do not have to save the world all by ourselves. But in Ottawa, same as every other part of the world, we have a part to play, and we have to do everything we can. There is no part of the world small enough or insignificant enough not to matter in this particular project. And yes, here in Ottawa, we do matter. And we have here the beginnings of a plan for how to mobilize and take action outlined in practical steps. I encourage the committee and ultimately the council to take on this project to support the work of the dedicated staff and community partners who have contributed to this plan over several years, and recognize that together with partners and residents across the city, this is the work of the next 3 decades. We do not have time to prevaricate around plans, either in terms of the health of our world or the security of our city. We don't have to be perfect in how we plan out our path, and the city does not have to provide all of the answers. But we do have to dig in and get to work, and the city does have a leadership role to play in catalyzing this action. So I encourage and invite you to do this, both in taking on this plan and in ensuring that a climate lens is applied to all departments and work across the city as the official plan is developed. Taking on climate action and resilience is a winning hand for the city. Look into it, and that is what you will find. And there are no winners in avoiding it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Appreciate your presentation, especially the focus on partnership. I mean, this could easily be called the climate change partnership plan, because it is drafted with the notion that we can't do this alone.
Absolutely.
And that we need to do it with the community partners, and we need to do it with other levels of government to help us achieve the goals that we've set forward here today. Any questions for Ms. Coward? Seeing none, thank you so much for your presentation. So we have Rob Barnes with Ecology Ottawa, followed by Raymond Lurie. Do you always wear black? Do you always dress in dark colors?
Only for you. It doesn't match the tone of this presentation, so. Thank you. Oh, can I click? Oh, wow, fancy, okay. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm just gonna quickly get out my phone so I have an eye on the time, just so I don't go over. So my name is Rob Barnes. I'm the Executive Director of Ecology Ottawa. Pleasure to see you all this morning. I just wanted to start by laying the groundwork, and many of us know this already, but we've come a long way. I mean, just a few years ago, it was hard to get targets out of the city at all, let alone 100% target by 2050. So, you know, I want to congratulate the committee and council on the progress we've made. And obviously, if you think about the context, right, there's a lot that's been going on. Air Quality and Climate Change Management Plan came out 5 years ago, and since that time, we've moved faster and further, but so is the science, and so is the urgency of the problem. And so really this today is really the tangible outcome of the climate emergency declaration that was passed back in the spring. You know, if we look at our emissions in this new report, I mean, it's the same picture that we've seen for a while. About half is buildings, half comes from transportation, which is, again, not to minimize the waste or agriculture as sectors, but the lion's share of the work needs to be done in those first two areas. And of course, you know, as was mentioned by the city staff, you know, we've reduced our emissions with the coal phase out, and you'll see that drop between 2012 and 2016, but now we're edging back up. And so there's a question as to where and we're looking at community emissions here. So where is the political will to move us forward? And I know we've been waiting on plans, right? That's the history of the city, is building a plan and then waiting on the plan, and now we need to implement the plan. So we'll talk a little bit about some of those key ideas in some of the plans that are percolating at the city level. And I think as was mentioned by Andrea and Jen in their presentations, you know, if you think about where the transition comes from, it'll largely be getting off of natural gas and getting off of gasoline. So obviously these are really important areas. So we wanted to start off by saying that, you know, the analysis we think in the Climate Change Master Plan is excellent and thorough. The 100% target is essential to meeting the IPCC target, as we know. The annual reporting, which is a new development, this is very welcome, right? This helps us, helps with accountability at the city. It's not just every 4 or 5 years, not just after an election. So we get to you know, see regular reporting. And of course, there's been a demonstrated commitment to community outreach and consultation, and I think Sharon spoke to that nicely about the importance of that engagement. Things that we're a little bit dismayed about is the delays, right? Every time we push forward, we see a new plan and it gets pushed further into the future. And now Energy Evolution Phase 2, a really important document, is now Q2 2020. This will lay out the plan. But we know that there are a lot of good ideas that we can start with before even seeing the final draft. There are directions that council and the committee can move on. And of course, displayed by the lack of meaningful progress on community emissions. We need to move fast. In terms of the challenges too, I would just point out that if we're looking at stage 1 on energy evolution, there are a number of projects that are incomplete. So obviously the city still needs to move forward there. 6 complete out of 33, 25 incomplete at this stage. So we'll need to keep an eye on those and keep pushing those forward. The gist of it is that the time for business as usual is over. You've heard us say this before. I know it sounds like a broken record, but really the next 10 years will be, if we're going to take this seriously, the most disruptive and transformative in the history of the city of Ottawa. And that we can do this while building a more resilient, livable, and dynamic city. There's still that opportunity, that very slight window of time where that's possible. So what do we need to do? We need to plan a better city, build a smarter city. We need to move beyond the car. This is the challenge for any North American city, and obviously Ottawa is no exception. We need to change how we budget, and we need to find and use our voice as a city. The mayor and the city need to stand up. We understand that the community emissions are much larger than the corporate side, and the city doesn't have direct control over them. The city needs to use its bully pulpit, needs to get out, needs to encourage other jurisdictions to step up to the plate, the province and the federal government. And I know that some of that work is already done, but we need to do that better. In terms of items that we have listed, I know I'm running low on time, but one of the critical decisions that council can make is holding the line on urban boundary expansion. It's absolutely critical to some of the smart planning ideas that we'll see in the official plan. That's a March vote, so we encourage you to hold the line on urban boundary expansion. Other areas have already been mentioned, but some of the promising ones around moving beyond the car are really exciting. Things like car-free zones, congestion pricing, price increases for parking. These are going to be politically difficult, but the science is clear, and we need to move in that direction. We also need to change how we budget. We can no longer see budgets like the 2021, where $66.2 million is allocated for road growth projects, while a measly $70,000 is invested in energy evolution. So obviously, we have a lot of work to do. With my remaining seconds, I'll say we're encouraged by the Climate Change Master Plan. We think this is great. Now we need a policy response that matches the scope and scale of the climate emergency, and we can still do it while building a better city. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Anything you missed that you want to? You good? Because you went over a couple slides.
Yep, no, perfectly fine.
Okay, perfect. Any questions for, yes, Councillor Brockington.
Thank you, Rob, for coming in. Appreciate your presentation and that of your organization over the many, many years, and I share your sense of finally we're here. You talked about some, I'd call it disincentives to driving, some of the additional levies or fees that can be charged. I pay about $6,000 a year to drive my car, so an extra $50 probably won't change the average car owner to switch. I think the focus really needs to be on transit and making transit much more easy to use, much more frequent. Can you expand on your thoughts, particularly on transit and what our city can do to improve the transit?
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, I think there's some organizations with more expertise on this than we do, but we're working in the community, and some of the ideas that we see percolating on the transit file. And you can kind of do both things at once, right? You can address the fact that we have congestion, and that congestion impedes the movement of buses. And so a really quick, simple, and low budget fix is dedicating more lanes to transit only. And all of a sudden your transit system becomes vastly more efficient and effective. Obviously funding is a perennial challenge. We think LRT is a great investment, right? The next question around that is how do we connect people to light rail, especially at these hubs that are being built in places like Lincoln Fields. There's one at Blair Station. A lot of this area are their former malls and parking lots. We need to connect active transportation infrastructure to those transit hubs so that our city as a whole is more walkable, bikeable, and friendly to transit users as well.
Thank you. Any other questions? I will say that you focused on one thing. You mentioned that we provided that report right after the election. We do that on purpose because we don't want to lose elections, you see. So what we do is we make sure that we hide all that stuff, especially bad news. We want to hide bad news, then we want to wait till we get elected, and then we hit you with the bad news knowing that 4 years from now you're going to forget that bad news.
Wow. You've just confirmed all our worst suspicions.
I'm just pulling the curtain. I want you to understand how this works. So thank you so much.
Thanks.
So our next speaker is Raymond Lurie with the Electric Vehicle Council of Canada, followed by Dick, I'm going to say Baker, but it could also be Backer. I've heard it both ways. So Raymond, We have a presentation, I think, up on the screen soon, almost. Matt's almost there, just waiting. He's like close to it. He's looking for it. He's got to put it on the screen. He's got to click, double click. It's just a double click now. It's loading. Now we just got to widen it to the full screen. No pressure. Solid. I didn't want the listeners to have a silence, so I just thought I'd talk through it.
Okay, thanks.
Mr. Lurie, go ahead.
Okay. Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much. My name is Raymond Lurie. I'm from the Electric Vehicle Council of Ottawa. And what I wanted to start by doing is congratulating city staff for the excellent work they've done. Andrea and her team have done excellent work with Energy Evolution in particular, and they're looking at real solutions to the real sources of carbon in the city. So in terms of carbon budget, I'm really happy to see that proposal. I think that if managers are compensated on carbon budgets as well as they are, and measured on carbon budgets as well as they are on financial budgets, that will incent them to do what they can to reduce the amount of carbon that's emitted. Reducing corporate emissions to 0 by 2040 will require electrifying the city fleet starting now, right? And same with community emissions at 0 in 2050. We're going to have to start transitioning to electric very, very soon. One thing I'd like to see as an improvement in the plan is that there isn't any consideration of concrete and the impact of concrete on emissions. As you probably know, 45% of the energy in a building over its life cycle is actually in the construction materials and construction phase of the building. So that's something to consider. And you can see there a mass timber building in the back there that sequesters carbon instead of emitting carbon for in the building. Emitting carbon for the concrete production. So here this is a slide that shows you that electric powertrains are becoming cheaper and cheaper, and we are expecting price parity within a few years. We're already seeing that with some various EVs on the market. This here is a technology adoption curve slide that shows a technology adoption from many of the different technologies over the last century or so. And you can see that there's what was referred to as the S-curve for adoption. Okay, so what happens typically is you have, as you can see here with current numbers in Canada up to 2018, you have a slow uptake and then all of a sudden it goes exponential. So what we've done is we've done some projections and we're showing that assuming that there's government support for this at all levels of government, we would be able to get to 100% new electric cars or new cars being EVs by 2030 or 2031. Okay, so it's really a good news story. We are expecting that even if there was no government impediments to our regulatory impediments, we could probably get to 2030 without problems. But we're concerned that we need to have government continue to provide things like incentives. And actually the City of Laval is providing an incentive that's added to the federal and Quebec rebates. The federal rebate now is at $5,000 for new vehicles. They've announced a rebate for used vehicles. There's other things we could do, other measures like allowing electric cars to use high occupancy lanes on the Champlain Bridge and the Portage Bridge, and perhaps free parking or other measures like we're seeing other jurisdictions such as Norway doing. We also need a ZEV mandate. That's something that needs to be addressed at the federal level because we have supply issues. People right now are trying to buy new electric cars are having trouble finding them. Now here's an example of inexpensive EVs. So I found this morning on Auto Trader, 3 examples of low-priced EVs. And because the operational cost of an EV is much lower than a gas car, this is really a good solution for people on a budget. Now the problem is there are barriers to EV adoptions. And if you look at the second from the bottom, community housing there, that's one of them. So a lot of our poorer people in the community live in community housing and they don't have access to charging. So we need to invest in that. If you look at the map, it shows that Ottawa has very few, I don't know if this pointer works here, no. So very few chargers, that's in the middle there, compared to Montreal on the right-hand side and Toronto on the left-hand side. Back to buses. I've talked to buses before, so Mr. Manconi keeps talking about looking at compressed natural gas, but you'll see in this slide that compressed natural gas emits lots of greenhouse gases, and it will not provide us a solution that will bring us to the objectives we have. Hydrogen is a similar solution, very expensive, also results in emissions, so electric buses are really the only viable option. TTC is saying they're saving $56,000 per bus on diesel costs alone, per bus per year. Okay, so if you look at, actually, I'd like to congratulate the council about the motions last week. But it really should be non-diesel buses and not, it should really be electric buses, not non-diesel buses.
Can I just ask you to try to wrap up in the next 30 seconds?
Okay, so there's other solutions. So other city vehicles, so there's fire trucks now that are appearing, garbage trucks, utility trucks, all of that. That's an excavator that's actually battery electric. That would be very quiet for construction downtown near other people, right? Money drives the world, right? And we are in a climate emergency. If the city is to do something, we need to invest now, not in the future.
All right, thank you so much for your presentation. Councillor, we have a few questions from councillors. Councillor Blais.
Thanks, Ray, for coming out, and I know you were limited by time. On the electric buses, I know you have some strong views on the electric buses. Could you perhaps elaborate for the committee membership?
Well, the first issue there is that the electric buses are the only solution that will give you actually zero emission transit fleet, right? So hydrogen and compressed natural gas both imply CO2 emissions in the production of hydrogen or the actual burning of compressed natural gas, right? The other issue is that if we're using short-range buses, those buses need to be charged during the day. So the Nova bus in particular that's short-range has got a range of 37 kilometers only, which means it needs to be charged when buses are used, which is typically during the peak times in the morning and peak times in the afternoon. Well, in Ontario, the electricity that's used to meet that peak is generated through natural gas. So if we use short-range buses, we're going to lose some of the benefit of electrifying the fleet by charging during the day. So it'd be much better if we were charging at night, which is more appropriate if we're using long-range electric buses. So at night, Ontario actually has a surplus of electricity that would be available to charge those buses.
Sure, and those short-range buses that you were describing, they're charged throughout the day with overhead catenaries, basically. Yeah,
they're charged with typically overhead catenary, which is the other reason we don't like that solution is it's very expensive. So the installation, we're talking $1 million per charger, and these chargers have to be located throughout the city where the routes are, because 37 kilometers is not enough to get back to the bus depot and then do the run, right? So you have to put them where you think you may need them long term. So it's a difficult planning exercise, and it results in a bus system that's not very flexible, because you have to, you have to drive the buses where there's charging available, right?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Menard.
Thanks very much, Chair. Thanks very much, Ray, for coming in. My questions follow Councillor Blais. Councillor Blais asked a question at Council the other day around what kind of buses we're buying for the electric bus pilot, and it wasn't clear from OC Transpo's answer that they were going to be the non-catenary, that the ones that require charging in the evening, not continuous charges, which I understand is not something we really want to go, that road we want to go down, but it's not clear to me where OC Transpo is going. Can you confirm how the availability of long-range and short-range buses that don't use the catenary in Canada? I know there's several companies that do this now. Can you just confirm these are available, these are being adopted in multiple cities across the country in North America?
So if you look worldwide at the bus market, about half of the new buses today are electric, and the vast majority, somewhere near 98% of those are using are long-range buses. Right? In terms of availability, I know that there was some question about the standardization of plugs at the or charging methods at the city meeting. The industry for slower charging if you could put it that way, so charging inside of bus barns. The industry is essentially supporting the CSS combo standard, which is a standard that's used for regular passenger EVs. So there is essentially a standardization in that space. Now, the overhead catenary is not necessarily, it's not necessarily that it wouldn't be a good solution in the garage. That's what actually Edmonton is using. So they plan on charging in the garage using overhead catenary for whatever reasons, but that's the exception. Most of the transit operators are using charging stations in the bus barns that use a CSS combo, which is a much more common standard.
Okay, and the reason this is so important for this report today is that we're trying to reduce corporate emissions or organization emissions by 100% by 2040, and a huge portion of that for us is our fleet. Yes. And the reduction of diesel. And so this is a must. And I mean, to me, the city is not moving fast enough on this. There's resistance from OC Transpo when there shouldn't be. We should be moving much quicker on this type of initiative. So are there companies in Canada or North America that you'd recommend, or that you say, look at these folks, these are people producing these types of buses, you should be looking at them for your pilot? Because I'm concerned who we're going to purchase this from and whether or not it's going to actually be in line with what you're talking about.
Well, so we're a nonprofit and we're doing this pro bono, right? So we have no ties to anybody in the industry. So I wouldn't want to recommend a particular manufacturer, but there are 3 in particular in North America that are doing work with long-range buses. Nova now has introduced a long-range bus. New Flyer has long-range buses, including articulated long-range buses. And Proterra is the other big player in the field. They're more of a technology leader in that space.
Yeah, the companies I've seen, they're all moving to electric now. They're all adopting electric fleets. So, okay, thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you, Councillor Brockington.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for your presentation. Certainly the corporation has a responsibility to shift its fleet to electric vehicle or hybrid vehicles, including bicycles for bylaw, police. But we're a small drop in the overall bucket in the city of Ottawa, and really the challenge will be to ensure that private vehicle owners and drivers have vehicles that are not dependent on fossil fuels. We saw with the rebate elimination in Ontario, there was a headline 2 days ago that e-vehicle sales have plummeted because that rebate incentive is gone. What can the city of Ottawa do while working with our federal and provincial counterparts to move the yardsticks forward? It needs to be legislation. I mean, we're still building cars in this country that are dependent on fossil fuels. There are no timelines to convert that, incentives for e-car. There's the infrastructure that cities can build so that drivers can charge, but I don't even know along the 401 now where I can charge an electric vehicle. What can we do with the other levels of government?
Well, with the other levels of government, there's the building code that had a requirement until it was eliminated last year or this year, I believe, to pre-wire charging or parking stalls to have some charging station there. When you build a new building, it's much cheaper to provide the pre-wiring than actually having to retrofit it after. So that's something that would be desirable. So the provincial government actually passed Bill 123 last week. You may have heard of that. It's a bill that imposes a fine of $125 for people who are in an EV parking spot and not plugged to the charger. That's a good step in the right direction. The other thing that we would like to see is zero emission mandate. That would do, and Quebec has a light version of this, if we could put it that way, and BC also has it, but we need a mandate at the national level to address the supply issue. So right now, if you're trying to buy an electric vehicle, most vehicles, there's a waiting list of 6 to 12 months to be able to get them, right? And most people who buy buy vehicles, what they do is they want to be able to take ownership of the vehicle soon after they buy it. They normally don't want to plan this 6 or 12 months in advance, right? So having a mandate that would reward those who overachieve the target numbers and penalize those who underachieve would allow us to get more supply in the country.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Lurie, for your presentation. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
So our speaker is, again, Dick Baker. Is it Baker or Backer? Bacher. Bacher. I was wrong on both fronts.
Wrong and wrong.
I feel shame. So you're here representing the Ottawa Renewable Energy Co-op, OREC. Thank you. And our next speaker after Mr. Bacher is Angela Keller-Herzog.
Oh, I see. Thank you. Yes, I'm representing two organizations, Co-Energy Ontario and the Ottawa Renewable Energy Cooperative. Between these two organizations, we have 1,000 members across Eastern Ontario and a few in Western Quebec, but we're basically in Eastern Ontario organizations. We own and operate 19 operating electricity generation facilities on barns, schools, factories, and commercial operations and housing co-ops, and one museum. The Museum of Science and Technology is now running a system that we own. We also have 4 energy retrofits in operation now, and we've raised $9 million from our members, and that is financed all of our projects. We have no outside debt. We can do much more. We want to do more. There are fewer opportunities than there is interest from our members to invest in these. OREC, Co-Energy, and our members, supporters, and suppliers all ask that you quickly approve the submission that's before you and give it your full financial and political support to make the transition active. Energy cooperatives can leverage untapped community investment. There's money sitting in bank accounts that's not being put to work. The returns in the stock market and debt instruments are very low these days. So there's people our age, over 50, that are sitting on money that's not moving. And we can enact that money to be productive. The 20 energy evolution projects will need community participation, community partners, energy cooperatives like OREC and Co-Energy can help with the implementation of those projects, and we're ready to help on those right now. The city can lead by example. You can take action with your facilities and be an example by putting in those energy facilities, do the retrofits on your arenas and your facilities, enable EV generation or connectivity and electricity generation for EV on your sports facilities. All your facilities should be enabled now. You can encourage community action by highlighting what is good, showing that action on these fronts will reduce utility costs, enhance property value, and you need to make it easier for people to action. You should also discourage and penalize inaction by pointing out the value destruction of wasteful inaction in this site, and make it, most importantly at all, a nonpartisan issue through community-focused. You should be implementing this plan through a paradigm of positive community engagement, positive citizen engagement. Identify who your supporters are and help them be your advocate in the projects. There'll be lots of people arguing about the high cost of what you're going to try to do, but there are savings and there are benefits that will work down to the community and to the individuals in Ottawa. The community-based organization should be given a role in the delivery and help them unleash your supporters to support and drive this forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bacher. Question for you from Councillor Eglai.
Thank you. I'm just standing here because my friend's borrowing my seat, but it's good for the back to stretch it every once in a while. So one of the things on one of your, I'm not sure which slide it was, you talked about penalizing, I think what you called wasteful inaction was the phrase that you used.
Yeah.
Can you explain what you mean by that?
Well, by not making buildings more efficient and more livable, we're not acting, and those buildings will reduce in value. They will become less interesting to other buyers, Inaction is wasteful. It's perpetuating the spending habits, leaky buildings, leaking windows, leaky building envelopes are just pouring money out the window. So there's a cost to that. And that's not being highlighted as a value destruction.
No, but use the term penalize. I like to incentivize,
So if they don't,
I'm trying to figure out what you think we should be doing to
okay, so
penalize or to address the problem.
if someone wants to build a building that's not LEED, they should be at the back of the line. If they're building a new building that's LEED or a passive house, it goes to the front of the line as far as approvals process. That is immediate return to the investor, to the builder, developers, because they're jumping the queue. I don't want to say jumping the queue, but the banks and the financiers will be very happy about knowing that if they do LEED projects, the whole process will happen faster. So that's positive action. Inaction, well, yesterday I walked by 3 cars that were idling. The city passed an idling bylaw years ago, but I have heard nothing about it. Has there been any reports on how many people are being fined for idling? Just go down to the schools, you can make lots of money fining people for idling. So, so that's a bylaw that's on the city books now. I've never heard anything about it.
So, but to go back for a second, so you're suggesting one of the ways the city might address this is to create a point system or a priority system for development applications?
Yeah. What do you want to do? Encourage that. What you don't want to do, discourage it.
Okay.
And make that up front at the start of the year. And you'll have a different mix of projects coming forward, I would suspect. People are self-interested.
Okay, that's an interesting suggestion. Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry, I think Councillor Kuch has, just the idling bylaw has a threshold. It's
Pardon me?
the idling bylaw has a threshold. It's above like 3 degrees and under about 24, 25.
Yeah, we don't really want to enforce it, do we?
I'm just saying, yesterday.
It's annoying.
Yesterday it didn't apply, that's all. Councillor Kuch.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Mr. Bacher. It's nice to see you again. Just following up on Councillor Eglai's question, and we heard from someone before that while the new builds, we want to make them as efficient, state-of-the-art efficient, a lot of the issues are with our current builds. And just following up on Councillor Eglai, how do we incentivize the owners of those existing buildings, because many of them will be around for the next 50, 60, 70 years. They were built 50 years ago in our ward. That's the age of the buildings, and the windows are old. What can we do?
I've done several renovations in my house in the last 30 years. You control the taxes on the buildings. If they're at a certain level of efficiency, then the tax is at a higher or a lower rate. You allow buildings to be sold. I think in Britain, if any building has asbestos in it, it can't be sold. So the owner has to remove the asbestos before selling it. Maybe you could look at bylaws that regulate the sale of houses if they're not at a certain standard. That's one suggestion. But there are things that could be done to improve the efficiency. That's what Co-Energy is doing now. We're helping condos and housing co-ops and nonprofit organizations do energy retrofits. And we're financing that from our members.
Yeah, and through the installations that OREC does, there's a lower
those
cost.
are generation, but Co-Energy is doing energy retrofits. We are helping organizations retrofit their buildings so that they become more valuable, less expensive to operate, and have a better return and better environment for their members, for their residents.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Just before we get to Ms. Keller-Herzog, you can come up to the front if you like. I just want to say that to any city staff in the room who happen to be sitting, we have the caucus room in behind this room open with the audio, because we do have some residents still standing. So if you felt so obliged, I can't leave my chair and go back there, but you guys possibly could. So yeah, there's just the room in behind it. You can go and listen to the committee there, which would give the residents a chance to sit down. So Angela, followed by Charles Hodgson.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chair. Good morning, councillors. It's very nice to be here. I must say that I think we have a very complex package of documentation in front of us. I'm here on behalf of CAFES, the Community Associations for Environmental Sustainability. This is a forum for representatives of community and residents associations to meet, exchange, and engage with the City of Ottawa on environmental issues. The questions that I'm looking at in my short presentation is to see whether we are on track. Are we on track to meet our greenhouse gas reduction target? And will the climate change master plan and energy evolution model actually get us there? We have carefully reviewed the documents, and we are, first of all, delighted that we have now a sustained forward commitment for annual reporting. I think that both for you councillors as well as for us in the public, having an evidence-based and having monitoring on actual emissions is absolutely critical. So I thank you for that. Also, the renewal of the community and corporate targets in line with the 100% reduction in emissions by 2050 and the setting of intermediate targets also is something that we welcome very much. The delivery of the draft energy and emissions model and energy evolution projects will be a high-level roadmap for us to show us how to get to the targets, which is obviously an overwhelming and formidable task. And convening the council sponsors group on climate change will also provide the mayor with ways forward and break through the silos. So I think that also is important. So much has been accomplished. We're much further ahead than we were some years ago when I think many of us met in this very room. And the City of Ottawa now has a strong base of information to advance our climate action. But are we on track to meet the targets? And I would like to pull up a slide that Andrea showed us earlier. And you can see that at the very beginning of the graph, there's actually an uptick. So when you look at this graph, and this wasn't quite pointed out by Jennifer or Andrea, that our emissions path right now is rising. So, and after the rise, this projections graph then has a sharp turn. So we haven't started this sharp turn. We are still on the uptick. We haven't turned the corner. So I would say, no, we're not on track. The current plan, which includes the LRT projection, is the business as planned scenario, which is really the top line. Which is not declining but is flat. You can say that's great because population is increasing, but if you're asking are we on track to meet an 80 or 100% reduction, no, we're not. So the evidence says we still need to turn that sharp corner. So how do we do this? Well, the Climate Change Master Plan and Energy Evolution Phase 2 projects are an evidence-based roadmap and state-of-the-art tools to help us get on track. I would urge you councillors to seek to sharpen your tools and to fully utilize them. I think that the climate lenses that have been proposed are good. Applying a climate lens to the new official plan and supporting documents is good. I would add explicit language that the lens should also cover the waste management plan. To not have organics going into landfill creating methane is an important thing to ensure. In terms of our investments, asset management and capital projects, yes, putting a climate lens on those is good. I would further ask that you strengthen that to apply to procurement. You recall our discussion on dump trucks some months ago. I think whenever something goes to this committee, other committees and council, you councillors should be informed of what are the greenhouse gas emissions implications of the decision that you're seeking to take. So our recommendation is to tweak the climate change master plan priority actions before that document goes to council. You don't have to change language in the motion, but you would have to tweak some language in document 4. We also think that the carbon budget discussion should include involvement from the mayor's office. I'll stop there. That was my most important point, but there are recommendations in terms of the community emissions. As a number of presenters before me have pointed out, corporate emissions are only 4 to 5%. So we welcome the engagement that we've seen from city staff and are happy that senior city management is engaged on this file. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I will say that we did pass a motion at the start of this term that put the climate lens to the midterm governance report in order to add that to every single report. So we're going to do a full review of all the lenses. If you see at the end of our report, there's a full list of lenses that some of them are quite irrelevant now. So we're going to look at that in its entirety, and then the motion was to add a climate lens to every single report that comes to committee and council, and that was approved unanimously by council. Councillor Cloutier, you had a question?
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for your presentation. So just to situate us, you were saying that in your presentation that if we continue with what we are doing now, we don't even get to our 80% target that is our current target.
Yes, that is definitely what I'm saying.
And that, just to situate us, that 80% would not get us to the 1.5 degrees Celsius reduction that is required.
That is also correct, okay. Yes.
Thank you.
So the top line, sometimes in climate analysis you have business as usual. The top line that's been presented by staff is business as planned, which means that the emissions reductions from the LRT, et cetera, based on our current plans, are already incorporated in that line.
There are several initiatives that the city has done, the LRT being one of them, that would have contributed to that 80%, but even with that, we do not get to the 80% reduction.
Definitely not.
Okay. The initiatives that the broad wire frame that we have now and the further initiatives that we'll get by Q2 2020 and as in document 4, are you saying that they don't get us to the 100% corporate GHG reductions by 2040? Is that what you said?
I'm saying that staff has done a really excellent work in breaking down this overwhelming, formidable challenge into big chunks. So we're still looking at the further articulation, detailing of those big chunks. So for example, in our previous questions, we've several times touched on the retrofitting of the existing building stock. Okay, that would be like one chunk. That itself, that project is a formidable challenge. But the documentation that you've received at least breaks things down so that we can have traction. And what I'm saying in the recommendations on the climate lenses and saying that this should be, the climate lens should be applied to all of the decisions is to turn that corner in that graph. You can't just be saying yes, yes, yes to all this business as usual, and then we have a separate little stream of projects. But we need to start mainstreaming climate so that every single decision we are aware of whether it is looking to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in our community or not.
Certainly within OC Transpo and the electric vehicles, and when we reconstruct a road, making sure that there's sustainable, safe transportation built within that infrastructure are all parts of it, and that is what we're going to, those are the details that we're going to get. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I'd just like to say that, for example, very few people are aware that phase 2 is actually based on diesel infrastructure. So a lot of those things are not always mentioned, and I think that it would be extremely helpful for councillors to be regularly informed of what are the climate implications of individual decisions. And I think it would be timely to do that now as opposed to kick the can forward.
You're referring to the Trillium line using new diesel trains?
Yes.
Is that what you're referring to?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you. Council may recall that we did set that target at 80% last term, but there was no substance to that. It was just a raising of the target, but nothing actually tangible to achieve anything whatsoever other than the political incentive that, hey, we did something.
Exactly. And if I said that, that would sound extremely critical, but it's
I can say it.
Nice that you're saying it.
But I also voted against it for that reason last term. Did you have a question, Councillor Menard?
Just very quickly, thanks, Chair. On the waste management plan, I'm on the Councillor Sponsors Group for that. I know we are looking at that through a climate lens that has been raised in our meetings. I'll get clarity from staff, though, just to make sure that is the approach that we're taking on that. And your other points, we'll ask them in open session around the procurement and that other piece, committee council decisions. So just thank you for coming in.
Yeah.
Thank you. Charles Hodgson. And there are open seats. I see some folks standing near the coat rack. It might be warm and cozy over by the coat rack, but there are some empty seats at the back if you'd like to. But I'm not forcing you if you want to stand there. Fill your boots. So following Mr. Hodgson, we have Duncan Burry.
Thank you, Chair. Just before I start to comment on the last presentation, to reach the 1.5 degrees, the global community not only has to reduce emissions, but has to start drawing carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases back out of the atmosphere and sequestering them.
Can you just bring the mic a bit closer to your face? Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Think globally, act locally. This past weekend saw the end of COP25 in Madrid, the latest of the series of annual UN climate conferences, which 4 years ago gave us the Paris Agreement. By all reports, the Madrid meeting made little progress, and as Elizabeth May has said, there are good cops and bad cops. This means that acting locally is all the more important for us and all other localities. 10 years ago, there was another disappointing UN climate conference in Copenhagen, and that's the time that I started advocating for climate action at the City of Ottawa. The first thing I found out was that other people had already been working on the same goal at the city for 10 or 20 years, well before amalgamation. The second thing I learned was that there was resistance to climate action. The phrase I heard again and again was, City Council has no appetite to revisit the Air Quality and Climate Change Management Plan. But we continued to urge action. Sometimes it became uncomfortable and acrimonious. At one point, I remember sitting in the mayor's boardroom with a very senior member of the city, and I'll paraphrase, they expressed sympathy for our cause, but said politically they weren't seeing public concern from anyone else. And yet the city did promise to revise the Air Quality and Climate Change Management Plan, and the Climate Change Master Plan is the descendant of that promise. At the time, some people wanted more action faster. I worked closely with Graham Saul, then with Ecology Ottawa, and I remember him saying, it's like we can't take yes for an answer. Instead, we took the approach that if the city said it was going to act, we should let them act. It's been 7 years since that promise, and the city is acting, but it's acting slowly. In that time, the Paris Agreement has aimed us at 1.5 degrees Celsius, and since then, there's international consensus, and that's 197 countries whose scientists specializing in this area and their political representatives have formally agreed that if we don't get to 1.5, it has to, well, to get to 1.5, we have to do it in less than a dozen years. It has to be done and dusted, and that's now less than 11 years. And they agree also that missing the target is going to be costly and dangerous, and the current trajectory is aiming us at 3 or 5 degrees Celsius increase. So I don't think we have the luxury anymore to take yes for an answer and let the city move forward slowly. Last week, there was a guy named Tom Rivet-Karnak who said, the exponential curve of impact and risk is going up, but the exponential curve of solutions and mobilization is also going up. And we just don't know which of these two curves is going to win. Tom Rivet-Karnak was the right-hand man to Christiana Figueres, who was the head of the UN climate effort that achieved the Paris Agreement. So things have changed in Ottawa over 10 years. Politically, we are seeing broad public concern. You have before you an ambitious local climate plan, and I urge you to grab it with both hands. Most of your constituents are concerned, and more will become concerned as time goes on. You can be on the leading edge of these solutions. And I'll leave you with an analogy. A long time ago, the City of Ottawa dithered and declined for 15 years to take on a city infrastructure project, mostly because it was too expensive. In the end, they did spend the money. They were right to fear that cost, because now the municipal project is valued at over $16 billion. The time was 150 years ago, and the project was piped city water and sewers. Can you imagine? It was expensive, but can you imagine having a city without piped city water and sewers? Climate change is the same. It'll be a big effort, but it's going ahead without it is unimaginable. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hodgson. Any questions for delegation? Seeing none, thank you. Mr. Burry with Waste Watch Ottawa, followed by David McNichol.
Thank you, Chair, members of Council. I'm here with Waste Watch Ottawa. Firstly, just want to encourage the committee and later council to adopt the recommendation to reduce corporate greenhouse gas emissions by 100% by 2040. This is a challenging target, but one that is entirely consistent with the declaration of a climate emergency that you made earlier. In support of the recommendation and to ensure that the target is woven into all that the city does, we would strongly urge that the Solid Waste Master Plan incorporate this as a zero-emission target in its planning process. So to pick up on the point that Councillor Menard made and Angela Keller-Herzog, all future waste management program and technology options that are identified during the planning process should be reviewed and evaluated through a climate lens, and with a goal of a zero-emission waste management system by 2040, if not earlier. The staff report notes that solid waste represents 9% of a city's corporate greenhouse gas emissions, or an estimated 21.2 kilotons of carbon dioxide equivalent. While this may seem small in the overall context of a city's operations, waste is an area where reductions in greenhouse gases are clearly possible, and total greenhouse gas generation is not insignificant. It is noted that waste, in fact, greenhouse gas emissions will increase over the coming years as the amount of waste goes in place in Trail Road increases and the opening of a new landfill cell. So just to note that the track we're on that is upwards. So with this, we'd like to bring to your attention two very clear implications resulting from a commitment to this kind of a target. Firstly, zero emissions means that no organic materials from Green Bin program or anywhere else should be disposed of in the Trail Road landfill site. So that's a point was made by a couple. So, and I note that, in fact, in the project of energy evolution, these are one of the projects that's focused on. So that's really, really important. The city obviously does collect a certain amount of the gas, that's a large amount of the gas that's released from Trail Road, but doesn't get it all, so zero organics. The other issue, which is perhaps equally important, is that zero emissions means no incineration of waste either. You burn waste, you produce CO2. Incineration produces, according to a UK data, approximately 1 ton of CO2 for every 1 ton of garbage burned. There's a range there of between 0.7 tons of CO2 to 1.7 tons of CO2 based on the analysis of waste incinerators in the UK. The factor that's important there is the amount of carbon in the waste, and that's a factor of how much organics is in there, how much wood is in there, and perhaps most importantly, how much plastic is in there. So what we want to do again is to recognize that incineration produces CO2, and in fact, although it's a smaller number compared to the methane that's generated from organics, The fact is, over the lifetime of a long 30-year lifetime of a waste incinerator, you could be generating a significant amount of greenhouse gas, perhaps 7.5 million tons at the higher end of that range. So to conclude, zero emissions target for 2040 means no organics disposal at all, and it means no incineration. There are viable alternatives for both organics disposal and incineration, and we sincerely hope that with a detailed analysis of climate change impacts woven into the waste plan, that will identify and pursue options that are part of a waste management strategy designed to help and address the climate emergency. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Question, yes, Councillor Kavanagh, question for Mr. Burry.
Thank you, Duncan. You talked about incinerators, because I often get asked about that because people see it as an efficiency, and of course it was tried in the city in the past, and it sounds like you're totally ruling that out, and that's what I've heard from experts as well. So do you see ways that we can capture the gas in the future? Is that something that we should look more closely at?
In terms of the organics you're talking about, Councillor?
Yeah.
Well, there's two ways to do this. You can do it through an anaerobic digester system, and you collect the gas and you produce a fuel. In fact, Toronto has digesters, and they in fact are using that fuel to fuel their garbage truck fleet. That's something which is happening. The other option, obviously, is an aerobic system, which doesn't produce methane, and that's the kind of system we have. And that's one of the discussions which need to happen, I think, during the waste plan. But clearly, when you look at this, you need to think about what the emissions are and what the total sort of net releases are with either of those options.
Thank you.
Thank you. So you're not okay with an incinerator at Lincoln Fields? It's a good blank canvas. We could.
I got to ask my son that. He has a PhD in atmospheric chemistry, and he just rolled his eyes when I even asked about those things.
Any other questions for Mr. Burry? No, seeing none. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Now we have Mr. McNichol, followed by Elamar.
Good morning, Chair Moffat, councillors. So I sent a one-page flyer in. I guess I'm a slow cooker. I don't actually support the recommendations 2, 3, or 6 as such, and I offer some comments on them. So I think I'd just read some of the comments off to you that I made. City of Ottawa started work on climate change about 1992. I have the pamphlet right here, the summary pamphlet. So in 2019, we're still not collecting robust data into a coherent methodology. So I have a kind of weary skepticism here, and I apologize for that, but I'm going to have to be convinced. I'm really excited that we're going to have yearly reporting, but I'm not convinced for reasons that I also lay out that we're still not focused properly. In 1995, the Ottawa South Community Association wrote the regional chair regarding research into the official plan, which is sort of where we are now. And we never did get a proper response on what we were terming sort of missing master plans. So as we contemplate a climate change master plan, in my terms, we still have no social master plan, we still have no energy master plan. So skepticism aside, I'm looking for a balance for us to move forward. And I'm not convinced that the climate change as presented will be balanced by other master plans. I had 2 appeals regarding the lack of green space master plan, and now we have an urban green space master plan that's expanding and hopefully one day will compete with the transportation master plan. So in 1919, scientists are still working with the planetary boundaries, and my flyer that I sent in to you shows that they have constructed 9 planetary boundaries, which is to say that climate change is not independent of your official plan, not independent of the freshwater use, not independent of aerosols or pollution. So climate change, without showing me the metrics, I'm looking for a much larger approach to this matter of our land use. I took a quick look at the terms of reference of this committee, and it would struggle trying to deal with my thoughts on this matter. I'm sorry. Regarding hydrological cycles, the short story is that the federal government commissioned a 2-year report into the Ottawa River, and the report did not call for a council for the Ottawa River. The consequence of that is that you have no watershed planning, and the watershed planning is not independent of your climate change. So you will struggle because you're contained by the constitutional bodies, Canada and Ontario and Quebec. And further to that, Ottawa, in my terms anyway, from what I was able to gather, made no comments on the upcoming closure of 2 nuclear facilities on the Ottawa River. So I'm not convinced that we're ready to walk the walk yet for climate change. I hope we are, but I'm just not convinced. So I'll thank you for your time, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Do we have any questions for Mr. McNichol? Seeing none, just thank you for taking the time. And I know you came and presented your planetary skates video at our joint meeting of planning and NARAC as well.
I did, sir. So season's best to everybody.
Many of us saw that. Thank you. So our next speaker is Ella Marr, followed by Michelle Meyer of Prevent Cancer Now. Ella Marr is with P2 Peak Consulting.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you perfectly.
Okay, hello and thank you very much. A little bit of background. I'm a Comp Sci 1981 graduate. I'm a member of the Ottawa Tech community and a member of the Ottawa business community. And like many people here today, I'm also a parent. I know that in many cases here, I will be preaching to the choir. And where that is the case, I both thank you and I also ask for your indulgence. These are not my usual stomping grounds. I am, however, compelled to be here today to show that business people really do care, to emphasize the importance of this plan, and to emphasize the importance for aggressive action. We know that the IPCC is the United Nations body for assessing the science related to climate change and for reporting to the world on its findings. What not everybody may know today, and I think Charles Hodson alluded to it, is that the IPCC is made up of both scientists and politicians representing every single country on Earth. The IPCC cannot publish a single recommendation without each and every representative agreeing to do so. Nowhere on Earth has an organization acted with more integrity and more diligence in making recommendations that affect mankind. There is no more reliable source of information. The IPCC tells us, as you have heard, that we have less than 12 years to drive results to avoid the very worst of this climate crisis. We are sitting here in this incredibly civilized room on this incredibly normal day, and it is so damn hard to speak of the risks ahead without sounding phenomenally melodramatic. But without real and measurable results, we know that the climate crisis' full force is not centuries, but merely decades away. We know that vicious storms will make our most recent tornadoes, sadly, seem but minor. West Coast fires will grow in intensity and in frequency. Island nations will be taken out entirely. Countries with large coastal populations will face horrific loss of lives and the need for mega mass migration. These aren't just cities in developing countries. Think of Vancouver, Think of Amsterdam, think of Tokyo, New York. Hundreds of millions of people displaced over the coming decades. Our world, plagued by such instability, faces economic chaos and a threat to our civilization and our very way of life. I am sorry if I sound melodramatic, but as most of us around this table know, that is no exaggeration. Our city's elected officials, unlike city staff, have been slow to pay attention to climate action. There have been promises, but minimal action. But I am hopeful. Finally, at this summer's vote, the city declared a climate emergency. Some councillors have been on board all along, and for that we thank you. Others, like the mayor and many councillors who have not realized the degree of its importance in the past, have now risen to the challenge and also come on board. Councillors, like Jan Harder, have been open-minded. They've asked their constituents and they've listened. Our representatives voted to support the climate emergency declaration. For this, we thank you. We should all be incredibly proud. Together, we understand that this is an emergency unlike anything we have ever faced before. Today, we have a climate change master plan brought to us by dedicated city staff. We must support the most aggressive targets possible. We are running out of time. I know that many of you did not sign up for this. Many of you chose to become city councillors for other reasons, other good reasons. It is, however, your fate that you are in a position to have an impact. And I believe that you have a moral obligation to do so. And I believe many of you feel that way too. Support the most aggressive measures possible. This could be the most important and meaningful action that you take in your lives. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Appreciate your presentation.
Thank you.
Any questions for the delegation? Seeing none. So our next speaker is Michelle Meyer of Prevent Cancer Now. Oh, sure. More display at the back. You can go ahead. I'm just going to pass these out.
Good morning. I'm Michelle Meyer. I'm a naturopathic doctor, and I'm speaking on behalf of Prevent Cancer Now. PCN aims to stop cancer before it starts by addressing contributors to disease, and there is no doubt that consequences of climate change are on that list. Blunting climate change starts at home, and we congratulate the City of Ottawa for its attention and commitment. This is a game changer. Success requires transformation at unprecedented speed. And here we have a great opportunity to do tremendous good in our city and resist the opportunity for glossy proposals of fundamentally flawed approaches, ostensibly to solve problems, but that will suck away money, time, and opportunities. The city requires independent scientific expert review of large initiatives to avoid repeating what was coined the Plasko fiasco and to make the best choices for progress. Citizens, not vested interests, must hold sway. Broadband communications is an important example. There is a clearly better option that is safer, healthier, uses less resources, much less energy, and is more resilient and sustainable. Wireless radiation is biologically active and harmful, and there are better options. Fiber optic cable is far superior to wireless data transmission. The City of Ottawa should be using its diverse powers to ensure we have the most climate-appropriate and resilient broadband infrastructure. If 5G means more data faster, then fiber wins the race by a mile. You are wondering what a climate lens looks like? This is one example. It requires looking at different angles and asking many questions. What does climate-friendly and resistant broadband look like? It requires the installation of fiber throughout the city. Do not install several cells along every block, beaming non-ionizing radiation everywhere, even directly into children's bedrooms. These devices are complex, not durable, and contain exotic materials that represent substantial environmental footprints. What do the experts say? One oft-cited example is titled Reinventing Wires. International communications expert Dr. Timothy Schaukel states, "The internet has become one of the defining technologies of our society. It is our central medium for commerce and communications, and more importantly, for our public discourse, engagement, and democratic governance. However, it has been hijacked by the commercial motivations that come to redefine and constrain the availability, quality, content, and media of high-speed access in the United States. Canada is no different. Dr. Schaukel continues that history increasingly supports the proposition that it is unrealistic to expect private monopolies, duopolies, or triopolies, regulated or unregulated, to make the long-term investments necessary to build the enduring and sustainable public broadband fiber information highway that our country needs." In a document referenced here, he details why and how we must move forward in the information age with all of its advantages. He concludes, "First and foremost, the public needs publicly owned and controlled wired infrastructure that is inherently more future-proof, more reliable, more sustainable, more energy efficient, safer, and far more essential to many other services. Wireless networks and services compared to wired access are inherently more complex, more costly, more unstable, and more constrained in what they can deliver. I'd like to point out that Peterborough has been on the cutting edge and beginning the process of ensuring that 5G wired, not wireless, is in place, and Ottawa needs to do the same." Finally, in addressing climate change, I would just like to reiterate that Waste Watch Ottawa's climate imperatives mean no to any organics in landfill, no to pollution of organic waste with plastic, and no to thermal treatments of waste, including incineration or so-called chemical recycling. We also endorse Ecology Ottawa to stop the urban boundary encroachment and to preserve urban, suburban forests, rural farms, forests, and wetlands. They all need to be maintained for biodiversity. Thank you for this opportunity, and I welcome any questions.
Thank you. I met with the internet service provider recently, and obviously in the rural area, connectivity is a challenge. Everything we expect as a city, what our school boards expect of our students is to be connected. I live in a home that does not have access to wired services. But I met with a company that was looking at something a bit different. They're looking at remote areas and installing one tower, but then instead of having satellite towers to it, providing fiber from the tower to the community. So obviously it doesn't address the full concern. It still has a tower, but it reduces the signalization from each home to that tower and runs it as fiber instead. Do you see that as a step in the right direction?
Absolutely.
Okay.
And in the end, we need to recognize what is sustainable in the long term. It's going to cost us a lot in every regard if we have wired technology, and it's here.
Yeah, and I think they're actually looking at it saying that it's actually long term more affordable for them to be able to do the single tower with the with the fiber, because it's just they're having a lot of connectivity issues
Right.
in remote rural areas with big tree canopy and whatnot. Right?
And again, as a naturopathic doctor, I can only tell you the health implications of continuing wireless technology are absolutely frightening in terms of statistics around brain cancers and everything else. It's not a place we need to keep going.
All right, thanks. Any questions for the delegation? Seeing none, thank you. I know you provide us information from Meg Sears as well, who's involved in your group, so appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Did you want the other copies of this in your folder back? Sure. So our next speaker is Rob Dixon. And then followed by Brian Tansey. Rob Dixon? Oh, okay. I was about to give you a Bueller for a second there.
I don't like public speaking.
Neither do I.
All right, I thought I'd change the pace this morning. I only found out about this last night, so.
Take your time, don't worry.
The reason I'm here is because I'm a taxpayer and I see a lot of nice things going on, beautiful graphs, and I'm saying to myself, who's gonna get the money? And where's the money coming from? What I see, most of it's gonna come from me, the taxpayer. So that's why I'm here. The next thing is, gotta get myself organized. The greenhouse gases that people are concerned about, I think most are talking about carbon-based and specifically CO2. So I got a few facts here from NASA. And it says that the Earth's atmosphere consists of 0.04% of CO2. 93% argon, or 0.93 of argon, 21% O2, and 78% of nitrogen. Of that 0.04%, 97%, that's of the CO2, is produced worldwide naturally, and 3% is produced by man. Of that 3%, how much is produced here in Canada? 1.6% of that 3%. And we're spending an awful lot of money, it seems to me, to deal with a problem that is mostly natural in origin. Now, I've been reading some documents. Everything's so easy over the internet, but you got to watch what you're reading as well. And I came across a document that went to the Secretary General of the United Nations, and you'll love this. There is no climate emergency. In this document, they explain why, but in it, they have about 500 scientists, signatories to this, in this document. It's on the internet. I sent a copy of it to Mr. Cloutier. And in it, there's a whole bunch from Canada, 17 of them here. You know, sometimes you wonder if they're a bunch of kooks that are saying all this stuff. I mean, do they have the credentials or not? I know one person here, Susan Crockford, who is a polar bear expert. She lost her job in the University of Victoria because she said, as far as I'm concerned, she said that the polar bear herd is doing fine and is growing, contrary to an awful lot of other people. Now, who do I believe? Then in here, there's also another person, Ian Clark. He's from Ottawa U. And I'm saying that I think that this committee, I'm going to get back, I wrote it out, so I'm going to make sure I'm say it carefully. My question is, has this committee heard from those scientists who have challenged the climate change alarmism? I see a committee addressing climate change with a very unbalanced view due to the limited resources upon which they have based their actions. In other words, we've been listening to everyone who is pro-climate change. This is a terrible thing that's happening. I showed you this document showing 500 scientists who disagree with that. And I would say that no scientist in their right mind is going to disagree with it if they want to keep their job. There's a lot of fear amongst researchers, losing their budgets and all that if they say contrary to the party line. And that's what I see is why you don't hear as much as you'd like to. Now, these two guys, Tim Patterson, who's a professor of geology of earth sciences at the University of Ottawa, and Ian Clark, who's a geologist at the Carleton University, made presentations to the Senate Hearing Committee on climate change. And you can watch it on YouTube. I'd recommend that you watch it. Half an hour, watch two Canadians tell you their side of the story instead of just listening to what the media is telling you. So, and these two gentlemen have made it clear that he said that climate change is not as serious and drastic as being presented here at this council meeting today.
Say about 20 seconds if you could wrap up.
Okay. Any questions?
Thank you. Any questions from councillors? Do you subscribe to the belief that saving money through energy efficiency is good for you as a taxpayer?
Saving but not wasting, and not wasting money for grand schemes that will achieve very little, and that's
Right,
why I mentioned about the CO2
It's not what I asked, though. So a lot of the initiatives that we're looking at in terms of building retrofits, more sustainable transportation, it saves you money. You understand that, right?
Oh, yeah, I understand it. I'm not stupid. Or maybe you think I am.
I was not suggesting you were stupid. I was merely asking you a question.
Right.
I actually didn't say the word stupid. Anyways, I just wanted to be clear because that's really where our focus is. Our focus is on making a city that's more efficiently run, and we aren't spending vast amounts of our budget on energy where we could be saving money through energy efficiency and all the while be a bit more environmentally friendly as we do it. All right, so thank you for coming today.
Thank you.
Our final speaker on this plan is Brian Tansey. You can come have a seat because you've been standing the entire time. Oh, you got a seat at the end. Thanks.
That was a good move. Thanks. So, Councillor Brockington, in particular, you said something earlier in the proceedings here. When one of the delegations had already spoken, you said, finally, we are here. And so I'm wondering, and I don't think, actually, I think you were sort of summarizing what other people were saying. And so my question is, are we? Because this city has a history, not necessarily this relatively new council, but the city has a history of failing and writing plans and putting all the eggs in one basket. Plasko was a good example. And saying they're going to now, their plan is to write a plan, and nothing really happens. I'm worried. I don't really see the evidence, for example, budgets, resources being applied to the actions that we need to take. And if there's anything that's happened today that I've taken away from the earlier delegations, that I'm surprised at in a way, is that normally in this, the protocol for these sessions is the staff makes reports and the delegations make comments on the reports. Today what I'm hearing is kind of like the cream rising to the top of the milk bottle. There are all kinds of ideas for action. Now action, not action 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years from now, way more than you've probably heard, than we've heard today. All kinds of people have all kinds of ideas for action, and I don't see the going forward anything other than reports and more analysis and more detailed plans. But I don't see the city grabbing the bull by the horns and actually planning to actually do stuff, for example, in the very next year, that can be done. So I'm a little bit skeptical that we keep seeing stuff, reports and words, plans for plans. That was a new one a couple of years ago. We have a plan for a plan, which is a good way to basically do nothing. And with the Environment Committee in particular, for 2 terms of council, they did nothing, and then at the end, they rushed and said, okay, let's put plastics in the green bin, let's just go with it, and that allowed them to be able to say, well, they did something, but now we're in trouble with plastics in the green bin. This is not going to be good. And one final point, Councillor Kavanagh referred to, asked a question about incineration. This is the report from 2018 from the UK, where they went into the details on all their incinerators and what's coming out the stack. And I want you all to hear it again. I know I've said this before. Incineration and those phony waste-to-energy projects, this is not recycling. You're throwing bad stuff in the air. You're just adding to the pollution. So I hope that when we finally come to the long-term plan, we don't even see incineration in there. It is not a last resort. Incineration is not recycling. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Questions for Mr. Tansey? Seeing none. Thank you. And thank you to all the delegations that came out today. We also have some correspondence that councillors received, which is available to us should we wish to review that. So questions to staff. I'll start with Councillor Cloutier.
Thank you, Chair. Merci beaucoup, and thank you to all the delegations who spoke to us today. Appreciate it very much, and certainly thank you to staff for the report. I'm convinced that the science is strong and the technology exists for us to make the changes that need to happen. It takes the political will and changes, societal changes. And I will certainly be supporting the report and the recommendations that were presented. I have a few questions. What do we need to? There is a very modest budget in the current budget, the 2020 budget, with respect to $70,000, I believe. What do we need to spend to attain these goals and to produce this report? What will the requirement be in the budget that we'll approve for 2021?
Chair, if I may answer that question. First and foremost, the dollar value that we would need to spend to achieve all these budgets is well beyond anything the municipality on its own ability will ever be able to do. I'm going to be direct about that because council needs to know that. We certainly are spending more than $70,000 in 2019 because there's only $70,000 attributed to the Energy Evolution project, but we are putting $6.6 million into the Trail Road facility to upgrade landfill gas collection, which, as you saw from the graphs, is one of the biggest things we can do right now to get a very quick effect on CO2 reductions. We're spending additional money on landfill gas collection systems, capping, and as well as our tree efforts and our investment in public transit, because as you also see, the biggest component of our community emissions is in how people move around. And more we can get people out of their cars onto public transit, the more that will actually benefit too. We can be doing more. We certainly acknowledge that. And what this report is a roadmap of where our investments are best targeted. So as council finds its ability to put more money in different areas, we know where that money is best spent.
Thank you, Mr. General Manager. It's well beyond our means, absolutely. We'll need, and we heard some changes that are required, building codes that need to change, and we'll need that collaboration from our provincial and our federal partners in their areas of jurisdiction, so that we could affect the societal change and the legislative change that's required. Do we have a plan on engaging with the federal and the provincial government with respect to any actual monetary support that they will be able to provide the city with respect to providing good data for our baseline and our GHG inventory measurements? Because there's a certain cost to that for some of the other initiatives that we'll see. Are there programs in the federal and provincial governments, and what is our plan to engage with them?
So, Chair, what the report does is one of the recommendations, I believe it's number 6, is that this report recommends to council direct the climate change council sponsors group to give them their advice on which matters to advocate for. Advocacy is actually ongoing already. We are actively talking to the various levels of government about support for advancing changes to the building code, because those are absolutely essential. The timing of that's really essential. We'd like to see programs by senior levels of government who have much broader taxation capabilities in the city to allow individual home retrofits, and that we see the city being the administrator of that program, much like in the 1970s and 80s we ran the RRAP program, which heavily insulated a lot of houses across the city and changed mechanical systems. We're a natural administrator, but they have the financial resources to put into those programs. We see that. We are absolutely advocating for more support for public transit in Ottawa. We're absolutely asking for direct support for retrofit of municipal buildings. So that's ongoing, and it will need to be continued to be ongoing, and this report amps up that to a higher level by having a focus on that advocacy effort led by the mayor.
Thank you. We see the initiative to reduce GHGs and also to increase our resiliency in the face of weather changes and climate change. Do we have any data with respect to Ottawa's experience in the cost to our individual taxpayers? And this is in the effort to convince, to educate, to inform, to bring on board our residents. Do we have any information with respect to how much climate change, if left unchecked, could cost individual taxpayers or individual homeowners?
Thank you for the question. As part of the financial analysis that will come forward in Q2, we'll be doing an analysis of what each of the 44 actions proposed in the list of 20 projects for energy evolution will include. And as I mentioned, that will include the capital and operating costs, as well as the potential savings and any potential revenue streams. That's on the mitigation side for energy evolution. On the adaptation side, we're currently working with the National Capital Commission and Environment Climate Change Canada to do local projections for how we anticipate the climate may change over the next 3 decades. That work will inform a vulnerability assessment and then a climate resiliency strategy. And as part of that, we'll have more sense of the actions required and therefore the costs to it. We don't have local information on what the cost of climate change will be for Ottawa explicitly, though there is academic research around what the costs at a national or international level will be, and they are extensive. One estimate suggests that for every dollar we spend on mitigation efforts to reduce our emissions, we save $6 in how we would have to adapt or respond to our climate, to the climate change.
Last question. In our conversations, and thank you for the briefing you provided me, and I'm sure to other members of the committee, you said that fuel switching is not a valid possibility. What does and electricity produced in a sustainable way is clean and is now running our LRT and other, we have other initiatives that will come forward. Can the distribution network support can we receive information on whether the distribution network will be able to support the changes that we'll be seeing in the next 10, 15, 20 years?
Thank you for the question. As you pointed out, fuel switching is not an option, and for the benefit of other committee members, I'll just explain that in Ontario, the peak natural gas, the peak energy from natural gas is about 3 times that of electricity, and that natural gas is used primarily for heating compared to the peak of electricity related to cooling. We are currently working with the Independent Electrical Systems Operator, or the IESO, on what the electricity distribution plan for the region looks like, and I'll just ask Mike to speak to some of the aspects of that.
So when we meet with the IESO, a main point is that they're required, or the electricity providers in the province are required to meet demand when it occurs. So we are holding them to that and showing them the model. So the model that's been presented, you know, we've been discussing it with them as well, and saying and asking questions such as, you know, as Raymond Lurie was saying, if EVs are really on an S-curve and we're going to have very steep adoption, are you ready for this? So those are the kind of things we're really pushing them on. We want to work with them so that we can, as much as possible, avoid costs by, you know, not doing a lot of extra brownfield work that could be expensive. But then on the other hand, at the end of the day, we, you know, intend to hold them to account that, as is usual, they must provide the electricity where it's needed.
I certainly recognize that, but they're, you know, from Ontario Power Generation or Authority, we'll be looking to them to provide that, and it is a big technological hurdle, I imagine, a financial hurdle. I hope that we are planning with them through staff to ensure that in the upcoming 15, 20, 25-year horizon, the distribution network is there to support the initiatives that this city and other cities will be doing. But thank you for your report. Thank you for your work. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Eglay. I just want to say it's 11:45. Councillor Gower is hosting a piano sing-along sort of thing at noon downstairs, and Keith's the soprano and Riley's the baritone, so I don't want them stuck here. So we're actually going to take a break at noon. We'll come back at 12:45, but we're continuing with questions for now. Councillor Eglay? You don't like that?
It's fine. You just may lose me in the afternoon, that's all.
Such is life.
So we had heard from one of the presentations, one of the delegations, that could we find a way to, I think he used the word penalize, I switched it over to incentivize, to find a way to prioritize applications, building applications that focused on creating more environmentally sustainable builds, whether that be a LEED project or what I appreciate there's be some issue around what the standard should be and how you get there, but it just seems to make some sense to me. If you continue to build the way you're building, which creates energy inefficient structures, then maybe we should be looking at a way to incentivize building in such a way that what we're building will stand the test of time better, will be more energy efficient, and at the end of the day will be more cost effective to run for the owners. So have we looked at that? Can we look at that?
So Chair, I'll take that question. So first of all, Municipal Act prevents you from giving money directly to a business of any sort because it's considered bonusing under the Act. So we could not offer financial incentives to businesses. Then the question of to individual homeowners it is legally possible. It becomes a financial capacity issue, and we can look at that. As I indicated earlier, we strongly feel that a program like the RRAP program that's ran for decades and was incredibly successful, where the federal government provides the money and we administer it, and they're apparently interested in looking at that, is a good way to go, and we would strongly support that direction. But in terms of some of the suggestions made by some of the delegates about whether or not someone coming in with an application for a net zero building could get a fast track, we're looking at high performance standards, and we'll take a look at that. I will have to look at see what the various rules allow, but I'm open to the idea.
No, and I appreciate that. Thank you. I wasn't suggesting a bonusing type of scenario. What I was suggesting was a prioritizing, if you will, of applications as they come in, using a slightly different checklist maybe to determine which ones would go forward at what time frame. So if you're prepared to do that, do I need to give you direction or?
No, you don't. We already have a high-performance building project as part of the 20 items. We'll just add that as part of the list.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Councillor Menard.
Thanks very much, Chair. Thank you for this report. It's fantastic to see, and I know how hard you've worked on it over the many, many months, and I guess some of it's years in the making, so thank you for that. There's been a lot of delegations that have spoken about sort of we need to make sure we're taking action on this. This can't just be a plan again. You know, I have faith that we are going to proceed in this direction of taking action, precisely because of the team here. I know that you care about this. I know that the head of PIDE does as well. I know that there's people in the organization that want to move us forward. And though I've been skeptical in the past, I think we're at a point now where this is going to be a game changer for the City of Ottawa. We're going to take that sharp turn. So I do have a few questions about how we do that. On energy evolution in particular, which is a big part of this, in terms of taking action there, how are you involving the community before the Q2 2020? I know you've involved them to this point, but how are you going to continue to do that into the Q2 2020? And what kind of actions that, you know, I've seen the proposed actions there. How do we go from here to taking action on those, to actually implementing them? What is your own thought process around that?
Thank you very much. In terms of our commitment to the sounding board, which has been engaged thus far, it includes about 200 internal and external stakeholders representing more than 90 organizations in the city. Many of those have been involved to date in the development of the pathways and in preliminary ideas which have fed into the list of 20 proposed projects. Our commitment to that sounding board was to send out a survey in the new year and do a bit of a pulse check on how they want to be engaged. Historically, they've been engaged primarily on the mitigation side, how we reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, but they haven't historically been engaged on the adaptation side. So the first pulse check is around whether or not they want to be a climate change at large sounding board that covers both the mitigation and adaptation side. Second, we've committed to sending out, as part of that survey, a questionnaire related to which projects do you want to be engaged in. Although we've only shared the name of each of the 20 projects, we have preliminary thoughts on what would be included in the scope of each of those. And so starting in January, once we have a sense of who is interested in continuing to work on those, we can share the overviews of how we envision those projects and receive feedback on those. We're hoping to work closely with that sounding board and those technical experts over the first 3 months in the year so that we can then bring the report forward in Q2.
Okay,
in terms of the public,
Yep.
the public side,
Yes.
that deals primarily with key stakeholders who have either technical expertise or have been involved in the process over the last 3 years. From the perspective of the public, we recognize that all organizations in Ottawa have a role to play, whether it's private residents, institutions, or organizations. We will be hiring a communication and outreach coordinator in the new year, and as part of that position, we will develop a communication and engagement strategy focused not only on the experts who have been involved to date, but also giving some sense of how to engage the public. Certainly one of the things we've heard from the council sponsors group is that folks are hungry to understand what they can do as individuals. So part of that will be developing some messaging for councillors who are receiving those requests and updating information that we have so that we can help individuals understand the role that they play in the climate solutions.
Okay, thank you for that. Another piece of this is our cooperation with provincial, federal governments. In Ottawa, our grants game, I guess you could call it, has been, I think, personally, I believe it's been lagging behind, and that we can do a better job of seeking grants from other orders of government and working in collaboration with them. We need a plan to do that. It doesn't just happen. You have to have people that are experts on writing grants. They need to understand what those governments want to see. You need to meet with the staff at those orders to make sure that you're putting in there what they want to see. So the cooperation, the advocacy on council's side, I think is great. What are we going to do though to up our grants game? So this is a major part of being able to not make municipal expenditures as much, but have other orders pay for it. It's a big part of our budget. It's often unrecognized of how much more we could be taking in that prevents sort of large tax increases. So what is a way that we can actually facilitate further action on this?
So Chair, if I may start, and then Ms. Flowers will add to what I'm saying. On a macro level here at the city manager's office actually does track grant opportunities, and when they become available, they're fanned out to the various departments, and departments claim them to pursue them. And there was an example recently, council may remember, there was a major grant program available for recreational facilities, which my colleagues in our CFS took the lead on. We provided support. So there is a centralized way of tracking and pursuing it. We have a list of active programs through FCM and other opportunities that are directly related to this. We are following those opportunities, and we will be submitting. One of the things those grant programs often say to us is this project part of a broader plan or not? And if council takes our recommendations today, we'll be able to vehemently say, yes, it's part of a broader plan now, not just a one-off. So this, if council adopts this report, it improves our odds of getting those grants. Ms. Flowers may add a little bit.
Okay. If I may add to that, in terms of some of the progress we've made this year, we were successful in a $50,000 grant to install an electric vehicle charger at Bob Macquarie. And working with Envari, we have submitted a funding proposal to install 13 double-headed EV charging stations throughout the city. We are also working on an FCM application for a biogas optimization study, and we'll be submitting an application to the FCM for a waste heat survey. Separate from that, I'm encouraged by the letters which have been issued to the federal ministers just last Friday, in which a number of incentives have been outlined and a number of key areas for ministers to support on. So we've gone through those letters and have a sense of where the climate-related touch points might be. And I think part of two of the proposed projects, the first around advocacy, will be looking at how these ministerial mandate letters align with energy evolution and figuring out how to tangibly advocate related to their mandates. And second, on Fund the Evolution, one of the proposed 20 projects, it does include a funding strategy, and as the general manager has pointed out, we are currently tracking open opportunities.
That's great. One of the areas that we're looking at making a major shift on is within heat pumps, and I think that's the right strategy. There's been a lot of work done by Enercan, as an example, on heat pumps and the technology, and we now see cold climate heat pumps that are able to, work down to -30. You still need backup sources of heat with those, though, and so again, that partnership with the federal government, provincial government, is going to be extremely important if we're going to be starting to move from propane, oil, and natural gas into heat pumps. The education level on heat pumps is low. People don't know what they are, and they don't know how they work, that they can dehumidify your house, they can cool your house, they can heat your house. And so we need to do a lot of education on these pieces. There was a grant program previously in the provincial government. That's now ended. They're a little more costly than, say, replacing a furnace, but they're getting on par with the overall cost of, say, heating with natural gas. It's about this. It's similar in cost. Certainly beats propane and oil. So on the heat pump strategy, because it's a big part of how we're going to transition in terms of the community GHGs, I'd love to see more. I know that's probably coming. I don't expect it now, but that we need more on that to educate the populace of Ottawa of how we can do that. Because a lot of people are still switching. They're putting in a natural gas furnace again, right? So that's how they're going, because they see how inexpensive it is comparatively. And so the more education on this, the better. I don't know if you have any response on it, but so hopefully we can work together on that.
Thank you for the suggestion. Of course, that's at a local level, but it's a problem that we face nationally. So retrofitting buildings and heat pumps in particular are a key technology to move forward with climate solutions. We participate in something called the Canadian Urban Sustainability Practitioners Network, or CUSP, and we have a call every 2 weeks in which we strategize about programs that we can look at either at the local level and learn from best practices, share research, or approach federal level agencies to help move this forward. Last year, we submitted a $30 million grant to Enercan about the installation of municipal staff to develop electric vehicle policy and infrastructure across the country. And one of the questions for 2020 is how we will approach buildings. And heat pumps has been part of that discussion. So we'll keep you abreast of how that evolves over time. Separate from that, our communication and education project proposed in Energy Evolution will identify key areas like heat pumps where there's an opportunity for residents to take a role.
Okay, thank you. My last question, Chair. Thank you for indulgence is around Angela Keller-Herzog's questions around the climate lens. I'm going to key in on the procurement piece because I think waste management, we are doing that as part of our planning. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe we're doing that. And then the committee and council decisions, I think we're going to get there. In terms of procurement, though, when the delegation raised that, is this something that you see that will come along with this? Do you have an opinion on why we aren't doing this in terms of capital asset management and other procurement options?
Chair, I think it's absolutely, I think Ms. Keller-Herzog makes a valid point, and I think it is something we are going to try to introduce. There's several measures in the second phase of energy evolution which talks about targeting budgeting, carbon budgets, and our department's actually going to be one of the pilot projects. I think when we get into that, that will become part of, they'll connect to each other pretty fast. We'll have to go there as well. So I think it's a fair point. I think we need as an organization to continue to work on it, but it's something that we'll have to evolve.
Okay, if you could take direction that is something that, I'd like to see is us move in that direction to take further action on that, to incorporate it as we are with other lenses in this report. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. I know Will McDonald was here at the start when I sort of made staff kind of F off and stuff, that he did leave the room. But I'm not sure if he's still listening, but we can make sure that we actually ask that question of Will directly. Will McDonald's our Chief Procurement Officer at the City of Ottawa, and then we can get a response for council for that. All right, so it is... You're not next, though.
There's rules here.
So I have to go in order, so... No. We can play a guessing game. Matt's next, but we're going to go to break, so he's going to... No. We're gonna go for a break for lunch. You're not as important as you think you are. So we're gonna break for lunch, and then we're gonna come back at 12:45. Thank you.